So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming, and sorry for a quick short delay. It's a very special day for us because we are welcoming Ms. Ellendea Proffer, the legendary co-founder of the legendary Ardis. Ellendea will be introduced by my colleague, Professor Yuri Levin, in a moment. I just wanted to say I looked at these two copies of the books produced by Ardis, and it was sort of like immediate set of memories, almost like a cluster of memories, which immediately I was brought up in the Soviet Union. And I remember when my mom came from the United States, it was already 1989, and she brought these very two copies. I still remember this very precious moment, like wondrous moment in Russian tradition, when I hold them in my hands, some kind of sacred signs of true art and literature. So my personal thanks for you, and let my colleague Professor Levin introduce you today for our Ameroslavica lecture, which centers on various Slavic traditions and their input into Anglo-Saxon American culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilya. Thank you, Ellendea. So we would like to welcome you at our third RIS Ameroslavica series devoted to study of formation, activities, histories, and archives of Slavic cultural communities and individuals in North America. And what could be more fitting for this series than the story of a publishing house, the very title of which embodies this bold idea of bridging cultures, bringing America to Russia and Russia to America, named after the Ardis country state in Vladimir Nabokov's novel Ada. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you today our special guest, Ellendea Proffer Teasley, one of the co-founders of Ardis Publishing and Russian literature Triquarterly. Before I talk about Ellendea as a publisher, I wish to mention the long list of her contributions to scholarship. She is the author of first comprehensive study of Bulgakov in English, Mikhail Bulgakov, Life and Work, published in 1984, as well as translations of Bulgakov's plays and prose into English. Notably, she's the author of commentary and afterword for Bergen O'Connor translation of The Master and Margarita. Besides being a leading and pioneer in Bulgakoviad, Ellendea edited and compiled a pictorial biography of Nabokov, and with Vladimir and Vera's personal blessing, republished all of Nabokov's Russian novels, and not only Russian. These tiny paperbacks, which I brought from my personal library, if found in an ordinary Soviet apartment in the 1980s, could surely mean a prison term for those in possession. Nonetheless, they were also extremely desirable forbidden fruits, and I knew a few folks who were ready to pay a considerable sum of 10 rubles for one night with Lolita. That is, with Lolita published by Ardis, or a bunch of photocopies made from their editions. I, for one, am extremely grateful to the Ardis enterprise, as my own love affair with Nabokov began with the blue cloth hardcover edition of Mashenka, which I was blissfully reading in the mountains of Jerusalem 3 decades ago. For her work with Ardis, Ellendea was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship in 1989. Lately, she became a prolific memoirist, and her book about Joseph Brodsky, which I also have here, called Brodsky Among Us, Brodsky Sredi Nas, was published in Moscow in 2015, where it became a bestseller. And I remember reading this book literally in one breath during my 3-hour flight from St. Petersburg to Frankfurt. This is a meticulous chronicle of the Proffer's friendship with Brodsky, tactful and nonetheless very honest account. The Ardis Publishing brought over 400 titles, half in English and half in Russian. And there is even a curious Princeton connection here, because we happen to be the home for the largest collection of Osip Mandelstam papers outside of Russia. Mandelstam's book of poems, Kamin, was one of the 3 first books published by Ardis. In fact, they were all published the same day. The poet's widow, Nadezhda Mandelstam, felt at ease with a pair of energetic Slavists, Karl and Ellendea, whom she tenderly used to call Karliki. And it was Nadezhda Yakovlevna who had arranged their acquaintance with the future Nobel laureate Brodsky. Ardis itself has already become a focus of special research. Its history was recently studied in a book by Nikolai Uskov, Ardis Amerikanskaya mечта о русской литературе, Ardis the American Dream about Russian Literature, and most recently in the 19-minute-long documentary filmed by Anna Narinskaya and Anton Zhilnov. Courtesy of its creators, I had a chance to watch this not yet released fascinating visual account. Referring to the works by Tsvetaeva, Dovlatov, Sasha Sokolov, and Vainovich, the authors justly claim that thanks to Ardis, both Russian and American readers have found the lost library of Russian literature. The book that Karl Proffer was hoping to write, but did not because of his untimely death, was supposed to be about the history of censorship. The title of Ellendea's talk in Princeton is apt and in tune with what is going on in the world at large. Ardis, Americans publishing Russian literature during the Cold War. Today, Russia is in its darkest moment since the Stalin purges, and perhaps it is time to learn from the practices instituted by legendary Ardis and to revive its historic mission. Please welcome Ellendea Proffer Teasley.
Thank you, Yuri, but what can I say? You covered my material. I'm going to assume you don't know anything, although I think some of you probably have read what I've written about Ardis. I will quickly go through the basics, and then I hope you will have questions, because that will be interesting for me. When I was 25 and Karl Proffer was 31, we went to Russia on an exchange. I went as the wife, even though I was writing the dissertation. He was a young professor. I was a graduate student. And he pretended that his project was the main project. And his project actually was an interesting project, and it became a book later. And it was Soviet Views of American Literature. So he got to legitimately interview all kinds of famous Russian translators. Very few people know about this. You're getting special information here. And what was true of a lot of them, because they had never been out of the country, never mind to the U.S., their English was not up to it. They were good translators, but they did not understand a lot of American slang. And they knew nothing about current American literature, which we were reading. At that time, we were reading John Barth, Thomas Pynchon, people like that. Their knowledge seemed to stop with Hemingway and Faulkner. They didn't know there were entire new worlds of poetry and novels in America. So that was very interesting to us. On the other side of the ocean, American students of Russian literature were basically not told about Mandelstam, Akhmatova, Tsvetaeva. Anything kind of emigre or repressed was repressed with us too, sometimes merely by accident. Obviously, Cognoscenti knew who these people were, but as a graduate student at Indiana, which was not a bad program, we were not taught this. These people did not exist. So when we went to Russia, the big Princeton connection that you didn't mention is the reason that we got to know Nadezhda Mandelstam and all these other people that we were certainly not deserving of knowing, we were nothing and nobody, was Clarence Brown, professor at Princeton. Mandelstam expert, friend of Nadezhda Yachna. She let very, very few people near her who were foreign. And he had gained her trust over long years, and he sent a recommendation letter with us to her. And later she would send that kind of letter to Brodsky with us to him. Without Clarence Brown, who became a friend because we were all interested in Nabokov, and he and Karl had a correspondence, and then we met, we liked each other. But without him and that letter, we would not have gotten in to see the people we did. We met the major writers, the major scholars, some of the major painters, etc. We were given entree into a world that young Americans normally would not be. So when we went in '69, and we met people at Nadezhda Yachna's very poverty-stricken salon, Two of them were Lev Kobolev and Raya Orlova. Now, these were dissonant figures, but they played right on the edge of illegality. And people would come from Siberia to get advice about how to get their son out of the camps. I mean, to be in their kitchen was quite an experience because Lev was very knowledgeable about how you could talk to the authorities. So we got quite the education, and they knew absolutely everyone. And they said, would you like to meet Bakhtin? And we said, yes. No one we had known had met Bakhtin. We met Bakhtin. We asked him some questions. It was, really an amazing event. And then later, we met the major writers of Russia. And at first, it didn't occur to us to be publishers. We were scholars. We had children. We were both working full-time. But we had a book collector friend. My best friend, Tanya Nikolska, was a book illustrator. We had met by accident through someone who was probably a KGB informant. Her daughter said, you will like my friend Tanya, and I did indeed. And Tanya Loskidova, who would go through 5 husbands, this husband was a professor of hydrobiology, but that was his secondary career. His primary career was book thief, book collector, and extremely knowledgeable. He was the one who gave us the Zelyony Kamen, the green stone of Mandelstam, of which there were only 50 copies in the entire Soviet Union because it's pre-revolutionary. Mandelstam was killed under Stalin, and it was forbidden literature. So he gave us one. And at the same time, I became friends with the great theater scholar, Konstantin Rudnitsky. And he gave me a lot of Bulgakov-connected stuff, including a rare edition, never published, of Zoya's Apartment, one of Bulgakov's plays. And he had rewritten it in the late 30s, and that's what I had. So I had the final text. So these things were burning a hole in our pocket. I wanted to publish this play in Russian. And we were looking at the Green Kamen and thinking there's only 50 copies left in the world. But we didn't know anything about publishing. So now we come to 1971. We've been to Russia every year, 69, 70, 71. Our circles are bigger and bigger. And Vadim Fyodorov is giving us more and more rare books from the Silver Age and from the early 20s. And they're tiny because those publishers, just like us, had no money. They did these tiny editions, like if you look at Akhmatova, Chotki, or if you look at Zabolotsky or Yesenin, they're very small, on terrible paper, and they would be easy to reprint. But we didn't know anything about that. So in 71, about March, Carl decided, he was a former basketball player. That was his big career until he decided he was not going to be strong enough to be the first string at Michigan. He was restless. He said, we're doing everything with our brain, but I want to do something with my hands. I think I want to print some poems, like get a little tiny printing press and print a page here, a page there. So he called up the printers in Ann Arbor. Well, what we did not know at all was Ann Arbor was the short run and is the short run capital of this country, which means that you can print 2,000 or less copies of a book cheaper there than anywhere. The printer said, no, you do not want a hand press. What you want is an IBM composer, because you're saying you want to print in Russian as well as English. Well, that's the way you can do it. And that was the beginning. As soon as he understood what the composer was, and we rented one immediately, he was a super fast typist, I was a medium typist, we could do this. We thought, well, let's type up the Bulgakov play, and we learned what offset was. You could do a reprint of this Mandelstam comment, and it wouldn't cost very much money. And Carl had a big dream of Russian literature Triquarterly, which was that thick, and that was his true child of his heart, that journal. And we printed all of them. We were in this tiny townhouse, but it had a garage. And one day, all of these books, like 6,000 copies, came and were unloaded into the garage, and we couldn't get the car in. And that was the beginning of Ardis, but we didn't know it. It was more or less a lark. We just wanted those books to exist. And then we went back to Russia, taking the Russian books with us. They were small, you could smuggle them. And it was a sensation. And then Vadim gave us 20 of these tiny little books, like Kuzmin, all these forbidden authors, the lost library of Russian literature. But we also did other things, which are not widely known. Ardis was not just the publisher of these rare books we printed, or, say, of Aksyonov, Sokolov, Nabokov, and Brodsky. We also were the first publishers of certain titles. For example, Bieley's How I Became a Symbolist, Как я стал символистом, that's our edition. That's the first edition. Vaginov's Garponiada, that's the first edition. That's our edition. And there are a couple more like that. So we were filling in blanks in the beginning, and then Russian censorship, Soviet censorship, I should say, under Brezhnev, people don't know how bad it was. They started to tighten the restrictions. And the major writers started to be unable to publish their novels. These were people that were world famous in the Soviet Union and published abroad, people like Aksyonov, Iskander. And what was happening was they would write their major book, and the censorship would say, you can take this chapter and publish it as a story. You can never publish this novel. All right, that started happening to everybody. And at this point, Ardis had published a lot in English and in Russian, and they knew us personally. We were the foreign publisher that was known personally. It was very important to them that we were not Soviet, we were not Slavic, and we were not Jewish. Why the Jewish thing, I never figured out. I mean, maybe they thought we would get in more trouble if we were Jewish. I have no idea. But they would say, "Это очень важно, что вы не еврей." They all were Jewish, of course. So what happened was, at a certain moment, these major, the same week we were in Moscow, both Iskander and Bita, for example, came and said, we want you to do these novels. They came separately, of course. And we were stunned, because these were superstars of Soviet literature. What were they doing publishing in Ann Arbor? Well, when you have written the work of your life, it's your child. And you don't want to see your child mutilated. You want it to come out somewhere whole. And you want to establish copyright in the West so that there can be translations. So all of these things, and we arranged translations for some of these works. And then we would sell the rights to, say, Random House or someone. So what happened was, involuntarily, we started publishing the Russian literary canon of that time. In the meantime, Karl met Brodsky in Vienna when it came out. Brodsky lived with us for a while and then published with us. He spent 8 years off and on in Ann Arbor. And he would read different poets and say, you should do Limonov, or you should do this. And we would look at them and say, okay, maybe. And we had a lot of advisors. And then one day, Brodsky was in the basement, which is where we all worked. It was a walk-in basement of an old country club from the 1920s. And he was lying on this torn-up couch the dogs had eaten. And we were all looking with horror at the manuscript file. Because even though it was the Soviet era and censorship was tight, every graphomaniac in Siberia, in Russia in general, got our address and mailed packages to us directly, not through someone. And so, you're going through it, and it's all how Papa suffered in the war and how Mama, and it was all very touching, but it was not literature. And our angle was that there were plenty of publishers to do political things, which is why we had fights with our friends in Moscow, because I read Жизнь и судьба and За правое дело and said, this is not for us. This is not our kind of literature. Someone else will do this. That's Life and Fate and For the Good of the Cause, for those that don't know Russian. Anyway, very famous books, very good books, but not our kind of book. And all of our Russian friends said, you're crazy, you should be doing it. We didn't do it. Anyway, so we were literary. We did Nabokov. And if you look at the artist list, the author that we published the most of is Nabokov. And that's no accident. So we knew him. We were friendly with him. We corresponded. Carl would write the letters. I would make the phone calls. And we visited. And that, of course, was a great honor to be friends with Nabokovs. And so we were literary, and this manuscript pile was frightening because you had to look at it just on the off chance. But nobody wanted to. And so every Russian that came through, some Russians claimed they worked at Ardis. They did not. What they did was come for supper and proofread something or read something from that pile, and they called that working at Ardis. Only a couple Russians actually worked at Ardis. So this day, Brodsky and Masha Slonim are sitting there with us, and we're all looking at the pile. And Joseph says, this package looks interesting. Well, the package had like 30 stamps, and it had come from Egypt. So it's like Mandelstam's Egyptian stamp. And Masha picks it up and opens it, and it's by a certain Sasha Sokolov, and it's called School for Fools, Shkola для Durakov. None of us have ever heard of Sasha Sokolov. Joseph said it must be a pseudonym, but it wasn't a pseudonym. She starts reading it, and she says, listen, and she starts reading the beginning, which is how shall I begin? And Carl and I both, somehow we sensed that this was going to be our book. So she's reading pieces of it to us all day. And Joseph says, not bad, not bad. And then we started reading it. But it was a very pale copy. It was carbon paper, which no longer exists in the West. So it was, say, the 8th carbon. And it hurt your eyes to try and read this. But we all managed to do it in the end. And Joseph said, but how can he be a great writer that I've never heard of? And at that time, Lev Losiev, who was Lev Lishev's, was around too. He said, it can't be a good writer. Nobody knows him. But Carl and I thought he was a great writer. And it was Russian modernism, which we had not seen. This was the first time we saw that. And like our friend Trifonov, when he read it, he said, this is gibberish. And I said, no, you're just not ready for modernism. You have not been prepared for it. It's not gibberish. And so that was the Sasha Sokolov story. And with Brodsky, he didn't want to publish anything. Every time it came time to do a collection, somebody would have to force him into it. Because he'd get very neurotic and start rewriting and say, my friends can't get their books published, but here I am in the West getting books published. So he's totally neurotic about it. It was hard from beginning to end to get him to give up the poems. And he would rewrite them in the final draft too. We'd already typeset it, and he starts changing. It was like Joyce or something. So we became a real publishing house. And on the English side, which is really important for Russians, they don't want to know the English side. But how many copies do you imagine you can sell of a Russian language book in the America of those years? The answer is about 300. The emigres did not buy books. The libraries bought books, and they bought hardbounds. We charged a lot more for hardbounds than they actually cost us. So where we justified a print run was the library. So some 300 some libraries were constant subscribers to everything we published. And then, most important thing of all, graduate students, professors, they adopted our books for courses. We did the major translation of, say, Alyosha, the major translation of certain Dostoevsky titles, the major translation of the Golovlev family. These were daily, this was the daily bread that supported these impossible Russian books. Without the English side, which was half of our production, because I remember somebody coming to interview and saying to me, well, you know, all of the other emigre publishers wondered where you got the money since you didn't take it from the CIA. And I said, they didn't understand. They were in an English language country, and that therefore we could sell books in the English that they never published in English. So that was very important to us. And then Sam Sioran started doing the Russian Alive series, which was a series, a very advanced series with CDs and all kinds of workbooks. And it was used by the astronauts down in Houston to prepare for their Russian flights. Nobody knows that. Anyway, so we had many sources of interest at this point. Lots of articles, you know, some on 60 Minutes a couple times, things like that. And we would go back and forth to Russia and see our friends, and it was wonderful. Until Lev Kopelev wanted to publish his memoirs. And he was a really good friend of ours, and they had done so much for us. They had introduced us to so many people. They had helped smuggle manuscripts to us. And I was a collector of photographs. And you must remember, in those years, Russian retouch of photographs meant that you couldn't tell Tsvetaeva from Mandelstam, basically. It was just terrible. So I would get these rare photographs, and I would do these books of photobiographies. They had helped with all of this. And each circle would cause another circle to come. And Lev decided to write his memoirs. Now, what was the problem with Kopelev memoirs? Kopelev and Orlova had both been true believer communists. And he had been a political commissar in East Prussia during World War II. Now, if you don't know history, this was very similar to Ukraine now. This was brutal, brutal demoralization, rape, and destruction. And he was idealistic enough or stupid enough, I don't know. He protested and said, you can't do that. So they arrested him, sent him to the Gulag, where he was in with Solzhenitsyn in the Sharashka for, I think it was 9 years. Orlova had been something equivalent. She had been a true believer, and she was a translator for Lillian Hellman when she came to Russia, all these kinds of things. And what happened to them was very interesting, is they were very magnetic people, powerful people, intelligent people. Kopelev was a major authority on Goethe. When he got out, he edited the German Goethe. I mean, his German was perfect. Volga Germans taught him. Anyway, and she was an Americanist. Her thing was Hemingway. When Khrushchev made the secret speech, their world blew up, and they became dissidents overnight. They could not believe the evil they had served, and they were very open about their role in it. Lev Kopelev had confiscated grains from the peasants during collectivization, and he had justified it all. So you can imagine what kind of people they were to make this transition. Then they became people that helped others negotiate their way in and out of the labyrinth of bureaucracy to get your child out of the camps, for example, things like that. So He was a good friend. We could not say no to him, but we knew that this memoir was going to include what the Russian army had done in East Prussia, Soviet army, I should say. And this was unacceptable. You cannot imagine how unacceptable this was at the time. But we had our own little protection, and our protection was we translated current Soviet writers, Nagibin, Trifonov. We did anthologies of current Soviet writing that was legitimate. It wasn't ideological, but like Rasputin, people like that. And it all had literary qualities, but it was Soviet literature, and they loved that. That to them made artists something that they referred to, like one of my friends, the father worked, obviously, somewhere in the security services, and he just said to her, she was very young, he said, the Proffers are a complex phenomenon, сложное явление. And that was the top point of view. And that was because of these translations, and because we were very open. We were followed everywhere. Our friends were interrogated. We warned everybody that had dealings with us. We said, we're being followed. You're going to be on a list. They're going to know we've seen you. You have to decide whether you agree to that or not. And they felt they could risk it because of the shape of the publishing house, the way it was being done, that it was so literary. So Kopylev's book comes out, but the authorities didn't pick up on it very fast. There was some trouble, there were some attacks, but they didn't ban us. And then came Metropol. Well, everybody was very naive about Metropol, the writers and ourselves. We somehow thought, because Voznесensky was in it, Akhmatova was in it, all kinds of well-known people were in it, and some younger, that it could slide through it. It had been denied by the censorship, and the writers revolted, and they decided to very openly send it to artists. What did that mean? They had diplomats take out the Vyorska, which was like this, and that's what we photographed. And they were making a point, we are not hiding, we are fighting censorship here because this is literature, this is not politics. What's wrong with you all? Well, immediately, everyone lost jobs. Some of them left the Writers' Union, which meant they lost their insurance coverage. Lipkin and Lysyansky were elderly at this point. That was very meaningful. Voznесensky got on a plane that was on a polar expedition, so he was gone during a lot of what followed. It was very bad, and ultimately it led to Aksyonov being stripped of his citizenship when he was in Italy. And I was with the Kopylevs when they were stripped of their citizenship, but they were in Germany at the time. And Raya sobbed, and Lev just got angry. It was a terrible thing, because they were not emigres. They were visiting friends in Germany, and they had not expected it. But the screws were tightening all through this period. So once we did Metropol, they banned Karl immediately. But they didn't ban me. They thought I was the girl in the case. So I went back to Russia in 1980, and to go to Russia from artists, whether you were one of our editors or us, meant you carried a lot of medicine with you, meant you fulfilled a lot of zakazi, of orders. People had things they needed desperately. If somebody was writing a book on Toulouse-Lautrec, you had to get them the book that would help them, So you would go to Russia with a lot of extra suitcases. And so I went, and then the informers, all of Soviet intelligentsia, they were very naive about informers. They thought their circle had a security officer and their circle was safe. Like for Nadezhda Mandelstam, it was Andrei Sergeyev, the great translator. But the problem is there's always someone and nobody's safe, as the East German archives have shown us. And as Dovlatov said, okay, Stalin killed, say, 20 million, but who wrote the 3 million denunciations? That was the people. And that's what they're doing now, of course. So there were informers around us, I have no doubt. And immediately they discovered that I was not the girl, that I was a partner. And then they attacked me, I think, in Literary Gazette. It was something about I had come to Moscow promising the writers mounds of gold. Anyway, so at that point, we had been through one incredible experience, which was the 1977 book fair. And Carl would never see Russia again, but he got to see that book fair. And at that book fair, we saw our readers from the Far East, from the Far South, from the Far North. We knew the literary intelligentsia of Moscow and Leningrad, but we did not know these readers who would take a copy of Nabokov's Gift and copy it and send it through 300 hands. They came to our stand. They would stand in line for 4 hours, and then they would get in front of a book, and they would want to read the book right there, and we would have to keep saying, you have to move on, there are other people. And the moving thing, though, was the people that looked like they were serfs. These were not literary people. They were just in line because something good must be going on, that there were lines around and around and around. And the book that they all went to was Biography of Yesenin by Gordon MacVeigh, a book in English, but a book with photographs that they had never seen, including the very rare photograph of Yesenin right after his suicide. And they were very touching. They were very touching. That was their poet. And they got into this stand. They didn't know who Nabokov was. They didn't care about any of that. But there was Yesenin, and that they understood. So Carl had been through that, and that was an amazing experience. We met all kinds of people that we would never have known, and they were our public, our unknown public. So we're banned, and in 1982, Carl is diagnosed suddenly out of nowhere with 4th-stage colon cancer, which he will fight for 2 years, and he will die in 84. And in 82, I run Ardis by myself because he starts writing his memoirs. He's on methadone, but he's writing his memoirs. And they would not let my friend Tanya Loskova come to the funeral. And, you know, that was nothing, given what the Soviets could do to you, but it was something to me. I did not forgive this. Then in 87, Carl is dead. We go back to the next book fair, and it was freedom. It was a shocking difference. The guy taking our registrations said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm Ellendea Proffer." He said, "Are you really?" He was like 20. I said, "Yes." And he whips out my Bulgakov in Russian, and he says, "Sign this." And it was all like that. It was as if overnight it was a different country. And of course, when we went in 89, it was even more so. But at that point, they started pirating all of our editions, especially Nabokov. So as Russia got freer, they're publishing everything in Russian that we did. Worse paper, worse typesetting. And we had always known that our proofreading was lacking, but our proofreading was great compared to what happened next. And so then I basically, not completely, but basically stopped publishing in Russian and did only in English. But at the same time, really interesting books had come in that were not literature. For example, Papierny's Culture 2, Kultura 2, or Vailengenis's 60-е in the 1960s. And I was very interested in that. And we began to shift some things into history. like Maksudov, who's really Oleg Babyonyshev, did the first publication in Russian based on the Smolensk archive. Неуслышанные голоса, it's called. Nobody else wanted to do these things. None of the other Russian publishers wanted to do these things. But I thought this is a really good development, that Russian intellectuals are going to these subjects, and it was. So in '96, I went to Russia for the, 91, 92, I was on the Booker Russian Novel Prize, which was quite the trip and a half, because they sent us to England, they sent us to Petersburg, and they sent us to Moscow. This was 91, 92. And who was on that with me? John Bailey, who, as far as I could tell, didn't speak a word of Russian. How he was reading these books, I don't know. The waiter said "Когда," and he did not understand it, so I don't know. But then Sinyavsky was on it, Alla Latinina, Andrei Bitov, and me. So it was quite an interesting group. And it was very exciting, but it ended up with a compromise candidate that nobody was happy with. Because I wanted Petrushevskaya to get it, Bitov wanted, what's his face? Sorokin to get it. And Alla Latinina wanted anything but those two. And so it was not a satisfactory thing. And in '96, Ardis had its 25th anniversary, and the Library of Foreign Literatures in Moscow did an exhibit. Now, my girlfriend and I, my Russian girlfriend and I, had to go all the way and set up that exhibit and tell the viewer what each book was, why it was important, you know. But that was pretty great. And Voinovich and Bitov and various other people, Akhmatova, spoke for Ardis at that point. And that was probably the most acclaim Ardis got until I wrote the book on Brodsky. And then I found out what fame was. They had treated me like I was Madonna. Because I had written on Brodsky, this was a big deal because he's now God there. And it's like Dovlatov. Neither Brodsky nor Dovlatov could have seen this coming. It's just astounding, the level of their fame. All right, I think I'm going to stop here. Maybe you have some questions.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was raptured. I wrote my dissertation.
I can't hear you at all.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. I was just raptured. I wrote my dissertation on Thomasdad as a publisher-centric phenomenon, so Ardis obviously was a pretty major player, and it's incredible to hear your narrative of the publisher and its history. Actually, before my question, just quickly, apropos of Jews and Clarence Brown, in Filipov and Struve's correspondence, it comes out that the only reason Brown was asked to write the introduction to the Mandelstam collected edition was because he was an American and didn't have a Jewish last name. And that's what they were looking for.
It's so interesting. It's just so interesting what that's all about.
Anyhow, I have innumerable questions, but just one. In your early republications of Silver Age literature, you show incredible fidelity to the original structure of the books. I mean, sometimes you don't.
These are facsimiles.
Precisely.
Yeah.
I mean, you only have your imprint at the very end, and it's not even with your name, it's
Right.
just the carriage. So I was wondering if you could talk about why you made that choice.
Why we did that?
To that degree of detail.
Because it was easy. On the copyright page, sometimes we would put artists. But they weren't really artist books, were they? They belonged to Helicon and all those other publishers. And at the end, we would put, artists. But we were restoring, we were very defiant people. And we hated censorship here. So you can imagine what we felt when we got to Russia. We wanted to restore what had been taken off the shelves. Because we were scholars, as a Bulgakov scholar, I saw collections where they had very carefully erased his name from the table of contents, or Carl saw all kinds of things where they would cut out Mandelstam's name, for example, from some early publication. This was enraging, and you can't underestimate the value of rage for this project. I mean, Jerry Brown, that's Gerald Stanton Brown, who was at Oxford, he always said Ardis is a very American enterprise because, first of all, how do you do it? No British person would have even tried. You don't have any backing, you don't have any money, you wouldn't try this. But that we just blindly went ahead. But we were restoring the lost library. And they lost a lot because of the revolution. And then there was the forbidden. Kuzmin was forbidden for all kinds of sexual reasons, obviously, yet a major figure. And so we were happy to do those. But to say it was an artist's book, it was an artist-selected book, but it was really somebody else's book that we did a very faithful facsimile of.
And one quick follow-up question. Do you have an opinion about Alec Flagon's British facsimiles?
Say that again?
Do you have an opinion about Alec Flagon's British facsimiles of early Soviet books?
Oh, Flagon's KGB. I went with Alexander Tolstoy one time. I think it was in D.C. D.C. or New York. It's a long time ago. And he had a stand. And he had already attacked us in Kruk Solzhenitsyn and claimed that we got money from the CIA and the International Literary Center. They did buy our books, but we never printed for them. And we just went up to him and told him what we thought of him. And he said, yes, but you sold books to them. I said, yes, we sold books to everybody, but we never printed a run for them. And even if we had, that would have been a good idea, that the CIA paid for the collected Pasternak edition. That was a great use of the money. No, he was a horrible person. His facsimile, I don't care. If the literature gets back to Russia, I'm happy. That's how I look at it.
Thank you.
Michael?
I'm just sort of surprised that your description of showing up with all these suitcases, with all these books, and this order.
Well, not all these books. A lot of stuff, but yeah, American books or European books.
Okay, but you said you brought those artist reprints of Mandelstam.
Oh, yes, they were small.
I know they're small, but...
In the beginning, they weren't checking us very well going in. They were looking for radios and stuff like that. They didn't know who we were yet for a long time. But then they started strip searching us as we left. Like one time, Akhmatova gave me a beautiful little medallion, and they took it from me. They said, that's ivory, that's valuable, we're confiscating it. And they would strip you down to your underpants. But we never carried anything out. There were a couple famous figures from England who carried out address books. So when they were searched, the KGB got the addresses of everybody they'd seen. Sometimes people just simply lost their orientation. But we didn't take out anything that mattered. But take in, you did. And those books were tiny. You could put them in your raincoat. And they weren't looking for that kind of thing. When Solzhenitsyn hit, they were looking for Gulag. And that was a big book. So. Yeah.
Andrea? So thank you.
You have to talk louder.
Sorry, it was a really fascinating talk. My question is kind of, I know you saw countless manuscripts and read, pages, thousands and thousands of pages. Is there anything that, over the course of your career, over the course of the history of the publishing house, that you passed on, that you kind of in hindsight maybe wish you hadn't?
Maybe Grossman, but not really. I mean, I reread it and I thought, I really liked it, but, it was very sanitized. Even as bloody as it was very sanitized. I thought it was very good journalism pretending to be a novel. And what was best about it, like the letter from his mother that's in there, that's the actual letter from his mother who's going to be taken by the Germans. That would be it. I will tell you, though, we did regret publishing certain books, which I'm not going to tell you because they're all our children. But sometimes we were forced into, like one of our friends would just basically strong arm it. Brodsky was incredible this way. He would just have a heart attack in front of you if you didn't publish this book of his friend. And so, Limonov was not my favorite guy. I probably would not have published that. But actually, as poetry, those who love Russian poetry say it's good. It's called Ruskaya, right? I don't know. There were books I wouldn't have published.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was extremely interesting. And I have a very short question. I wonder if there is archives of Ardis that are accessible for schools.
If there is a what?
Archival funds.
Oh, yes.
If they are accessible.
The archive is at the University of Michigan.
Oh,
And when Uskov wrote his very bad book, which I haven't read, but all my editors read and said, don't read it, it'll drive you insane. He selectively took some things from the archive, but he didn't understand the context at all. The archive is very big, and it has a lot of photos. It even has some artworks. I gave them everything.
Does it have the editions that you mentioned?
You have to talk louder. There needs to be a microphone or something.
Does it have the proofs that you mentioned that Brodsky would rewrite?
No. Well, there might be a little bit. No. We weren't smart enough to save everything. For example, I had a long correspondence with different writers, and I didn't save it. But in Russia, that writer's son has it, and he said, I'm going to publish it. I said, it's just routine, weather reports. He said, oh no, it isn't. So I don't know. I was surprised when they published Karl's correspondence with Nabokov in Zvezda, because that was mostly business.
Yeah, I have two questions and of different scope. The first one is kind of political. Do you think that the time for new artists has come? The publication of those authors who are not allowed in Russia or who will not be allowed because it looks like it's for a long time what we're having now in Russia, and what would have been this new modification of artists in the age of, the internet?
Well, it's already happening. It's online. You can't possibly. It's too expensive to print books unless they're bestsellers or something, or unless you've got a subvention. Mm-hmm. And one of the publishers I know in Moscow said 4 years ago, it's time for a new artist. And I said, but you're going to do it online.
Yep.
And it is being done online. Like, I had to leave Facebook because Russian Facebook had so much interesting material that I couldn't get my own work done. I mean, it was like, there was one historical thing about the KGB in Odessa, which I could not stop reading. It was immensely long. And it was babble all over the place, basically. But there's so much coming out that it's very hard. It's like the early 90s, but now it's on the internet. In the early 90s, they rushed, and they were right, it turned out, because all those archives are closed now. The presidential, the KGB, all of that's closed. Yes, but it won't be artists, and it won't be Americans. Artists was unique in the world. As far as I know, there is no Chinese publishing abroad done by people who are not Chinese. It was unique in the world that way. And by the way, it's Ardis Publishers. This error, Ardis Publishing, is because when part of Ardis was sold, they reconstituted their subdivision as Ardis Publishing. That's not us. And that's like 20 titles out of 400. And they didn't get the Russian language, obviously. They're doing it. They're doing it. And I was interviewed by some of the, like Kolta interviewed me when I was doing the book tours in Russia. And they're doing very serious scholarship online. And as they're going to shut down a lot of the Russian internet, I see that coming, but they will use VPNs and there will be ways to get around it, I think. It's hard, you know, everybody says it's a monolith, but these monoliths have cracks. Like that people got their manuscripts to us during the worst years, that people were writing during terrible times. I think it shows you that censorship can never be completely successful. There are these cracks, and we were one of the cracks.
Thank you. And the second question is very different. You mentioned Triquarterly, one of the most interesting journals I know, and I'm not aware. Maybe you correct me if there are some research papers about Triquarterly, but it's really interesting project itself. Publication, the idea of the journal itself. It had, from my perspective, really great advantages and maybe some flaws as well because of this format. But do you think this kind of journal with three-quarterly, three-dimensional is possible? And a follow-up question, which is kind of personal question. Larry Gregg, Lauren Layton. I wrote about him a chapter, and I knew him in person, and since I didn't have this first-hand knowledge and I wasn't able to ask him, he was already passed away. So did your husband know?
I think that was all true.
It was all true?
I think so, yes, yes. There was a lot of mystification going on.
Yeah, were there other mystifications? Because my subject is mystification.
Well, one of the great mystifications is Carl himself. But to go back to RLT, you can't have RLT without Carl. He was kind of geniusy, and you couldn't have it without me, because I was 20th century, he was 19. It was a lot of synergy. And we were not looking for, say, the Omri Ronan style scholarship. That was already taken. We were looking for, you're a first-year graduate student, you know nothing about Remesov. Let us tell you about Remesov. Let's put a bunch of articles and translation together and photographs. Now you've got Remesov. You've never seen Lermontov's watercolors before? I've got them on the cover of the journal. And I did that. I did most of the covers for most of the books. Not because I was so gifted, but because we had no money. So you're not getting an RLT. That was passion and drive, and he was a workaholic. I mean, when I think about those long nights, oh my God. I mean, there were 14-hour days routinely. Very few people were working on this. But the Slavists from around the country would have their favorite translation they'd done for the drawer, and then they would have a review article. What RLT was about was review articles, like the Romanticism era and things like that. We had a woman's issue, we had a 20s issue, we had an 18th century issue, and this was, again, filling in the gaps. Our students didn't have, until Ardis, there was no history of 17th century Russian literature in English. But we did that. And we did 18th century too. We did a lot of things that were oriented toward, if you want to get an education and your Russian isn't good enough. And the Russians themselves didn't tend to do those kind of books for reasons that probably had to do with censorship. You know, like why semiotics took over all of Russian literary studies is partly censorship. That's what you could get away with. And so they didn't have good general books on certain subjects. And that's what RLT was. But what was your second question? Now I've forgotten.
Well, actually, you rejected the second question too, because Triquarterly had a good sense of humor. So the journal was not such straightforward,
mystification,
serious
yes.
mystifications, and the one which I know,
Right.
the only one I know is
No, there are many.
Mystification, but how well spread
Yeah, well,
the genre was.
the big mystification was in Karl's Keys to Lolita. And I told this story in Russia when they were interviewing me. And at first they didn't even understand it. It was so bizarre. All right, so in Keys to Lolita, in the footnotes, Karl has one footnote that's from Finnegan's Wake. And it's about that long. And it's got a lot of numbers, a lot of strange poetic words. And a poor Danish researcher wrote me, he said, I have read Finnegan's Wake 2 times. I cannot find the passage. And I said, that's because it's not there. Karl made that up. That is an encoded description of our romance. And the Russians kept saying, "Бедный датский ученый." And the other one was, we were publishing a collection of Aksyonov stories in English. I forget which one. And he said, here, this is a really good introduction by this Jack Johnson. Well, Jack Johnson, I come to find out quite a bit later, was Aksyonov. He said, what did you think of that introduction? I said, it's okay. You know, I wasn't blown away, but he wrote it. There were a lot of things like that.
But this is a great fourth dimension to Triquarterly.
Yeah.
Irony, self-distancing, and something.
Well, we also had a humor.
Internal.
We had a humor section, but let me talk about why Russian language people should know that journal. Because in that journal would go back to Russia, and it's 400 pages, 500 pages. Looks like it's all in English. It was not. It had a section called Texts and Documents, Texty и Документы. And there, for example, was first publication of certain poems by Brodsky. There, Garrick Superfine, who very quickly was sent to jail over forbidden literature, published 3 letters from Zamyatin, which no one had ever seen. So in that section, there was Russian language, but you had to know that. You wouldn't easily find it otherwise. And the border guards are not particularly literate. They just see it's in English, go ahead. But it was fun to do. It was enormous work. It ran at a loss, but it was what connected us with the world of Slavic studies, which at that time was very big. So all the students subscribed, all the professors subscribed. You got things there you couldn't get anywhere else. And we would publish articles, because everybody else was, I want one tiny subject, and I want, in-depth, 25 footnotes on this subject. But that was not what we were looking for. We were looking for general articles. And I'm sure sometimes they were not as good as they should, because we were not expert on every subject. And we didn't have anybody who was. So you had to take some of it on faith. But we were in touch with our audience there with that journal in a way that we were not with other things. And for Karl was imitating Pushkin. This was his современник. And he wanted a Tolstoy journal, and that's what he done. You must have a couple other questions. You'll never see me again. You might as well ask them.
I have a small question. You mentioned that the manuscript of Школа для дураков by Sasha Sokolov came from Egypt. Why didn't it come from Egypt? He lived in Canada.
He didn't live in Canada.
He didn't?
No, he was born in Canada to Russian spies who left Canada on a submarine. And when I took him to immigration in New York, actually I will tell this, Sasha's just arrived. He's running away from his Austrian wife. And I take him to immigration in New York. And they run his name and they said he can't stay. He's a criminal. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this is about the parents, right? No, there was another Alexander Sokolov. And I look at the data and I said, well, this guy has a different middle name and he's 10 years older than this one. This is not the same person. And thank God I was there, because this guy was so sure this was a criminal. Anyway, no, Sasha was living in Austria, His wife had gone on a hunger strike to get him out of Russia. His father was still very high in the I don't know if it was the GRU or the KGB, I don't remember. He did not live he lived in Russia where he wrote Shkola, and then he came to Austria. But he had sent us Shkola through some diplomat who then sent it out through Egypt. I mean, he was in Russia when that came to us.
Just curious, what's your current project? What have you been busy
Yeah,
with?
you have to talk louder.
What's your current project? What have you been busy with? What have you been up to?
Well, I have a very difficult current project. I mean, I have one big thing I'm working on that I'm writing, but my current project is there's the Ukrainian-American artist David Miretsky. I'm trying to get him a one-man show, and this is apparently going to be impossible. But, after artists, nothing is so impossible. So I'm trying to get him a retrospective. He's like about 85.
Good luck with that.
So if anybody has any connections at the Ukrainian Institute, I would be glad.
Any more questions? I'll ask one, since we still have 7 minutes. So you mentioned your attitude about Uskov's book, and I was surprised and not surprised. Surprised because he made an impression that he worked, he collaborated closely with you or with artists.
He does not thank me in the introduction.
So I'm not surprised because it's an awful book. I agree. And I'm here not to pass judgments. My question is mainly because we have here graduate students. So if you were to write the history of Ardis, how would you approach that, or what, according to you, would be the ideal story of Ardis?
He was very lazy. And he was busy with other things. And he's the son of my friend Tanya Loiskova. We all knew he was not suited to the subject. He doesn't like the 68 people. And he didn't really know a lot about the context. To write about artists, you have to know the context. For example, you want to know what the Jackson-Vanik Amendment was. His first draft he sent to Ron Meyer, who's at Columbia and is my old editor and good friend. And Ron Meyer said he has not included Koplev, he has not included Bidov. And he told me, he said, you cannot write this. And what it was pastiche of a bunch of articles, things I'd written, other people, and things Tanya had written about me. And then he had, 1,000 pages he took from the archive, but no context. He said something like I read the first 2 chapters in draft, and I said, I can't work with you. I can't do it, because there were too many errors. He said, Karl Proffer started Ardis because he was finished as a scholar. And Karl wrote the equivalent of 3 volumes of articles after that, plus the Soviet views of American literature, which Kolya didn't even know about. No, it wouldn't be hard to do a better job than he did. He was under the gun. Prokhorova wanted her book. Ernstedt paid for the research. He had to get finished. And he wanted me to go over it, but I would have had to rewrite, just judging from those chapters. And I lost my mind. I knew it would be bad. That bad I didn't know.
So the ideal book should, first of all, take into account the context?
Well, if you don't know anything about the Cold War, how does artists, if you don't understand the odds we were against and that our writers were taking risks, that people went to jail for our books, he didn't appear to know these things. And even though his stepmother, who was very close to, was herself a dissident, he just threw it all together. It's not that he's stupid or anything like that. He just threw it all together, and he had no feel for the material. You would have to. He did 4-hour interviews with Voinovich and Bidov, and used virtually none of it. I don't know what was going on there. Hard to say.
one question.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for everything you've done in your life. My question is about Brodsky, and with this awful war that is going on in Ukraine, a lot of things came to light that maybe never came, before. Specifically, the articles that, or I don't know, story that Brodsky wrote in 1991 after Ukraine's independence, after Putin, Ukraine's independence, where he called Ukrainians chachli, which is.
I think you're talking about the poem he wrote?
Yeah, yes, yeah.
Okay, they asked me in Russia a lot about this.
Yeah.
I was part of a thing at the Hermitage,
Yeah.
and they, of course, asked that.
For someone who really knew Brodsky,
Well,
what's your view on his
a poet is not a politician. And, there are a lot of Soviet-raised people who have a longing for the empire, not for the evil empire, but for the sense of this huge country, this diverse country. It's probably like Turkey longs for the Ottoman era. And he, in this situation, he would hate Putin. He would never, ever. You notice he did not reprint that poem. He did not reprint that poem. The minute he wrote it, people reacted. But I describe in my book on him, he and Kopelev had a huge fight, and this is before the war and before anything happened. This is 2015, so I'm writing in 2014. He and Kopelev had a huge fight about Ukrainian literature because Kopelev knew Ukrainian literature and knew the Ukrainian language. And he said, it's not Russia, and it's not a subdivision of Russia. It's an entirely separate culture. And Joseph denied that. And he genuinely believed that. And he could be snide. But, poets, like Dostoevsky, do you want to read everything he had to say about Jews and discuss them as a writer? I don't think you do. He would not have, he didn't let it be reprinted. He understood it was toxic. And I think he did believe it. I think he was imperialist in a kind of cultural sense, like Tanya Tolstoy is. There's a lot of people like this where you're surprised. But maybe we shouldn't be surprised. This is their youth. I met people much older than me. Their youth was the 30s in Russia. And they had a longing for that youth, despite what was going on. And if you're raised Soviet, even if you're Brodsky, it rubs off. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming.